And good morning once again, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to virtual AP US History. I noticed there are almost 500 of you waiting, so I appreciate that very much. Just a little shout out to a couple friends of mine out there, Mr. Tassinari, Ms. Tilton, Mr. Rice, and Ms. Zahner. Some friends of mine that have reached out and made some nice comments about what's going on here that we're practicing reviewing. So today we start period 3, which is on the exam. So the exam, of course, is going to be covering period 3 through 7. There is a link to the new rubric for the exam on Twitter. We have a Twitter page at virtual APUSH if you're new to what we're doing here. And the exam is 1 month from today. So we're getting into the really hot and heavy part of reviewing. So we're going to get things rolling here pretty quickly. And talk about some of the causes of the American Revolution, which is the topic of the day today. So I'm Mr. Horton from Williamsville South High School, just outside of Buffalo, New York. Welcome once again to our show. Ms. Farr is manning the Twitter handle today to answer your questions. So if you have them, please feel free to tweet away at them. So the overview for today, we're going to spend some time looking at units 3.2 to 3.5, the causes of the American Revolution, and actually wind up with the actual revolution itself at the end. And the very last thing I want to work on today is working on supporting an argument and actually looking through a DBQ and kind of practicing the skills that you'll need for the DBQ. So the exam this year, of course, is a DBQ essay question. So hopefully you'll find that to be a really useful thing. Overriding question, what were the causes of the American Revolution? There's lots of answers to that. Which was the most significant? That's where we're going to get into building an actual historical argument about the causes of the revolution. And at the end of the revolution, we basically have 5 sort of subtopics today. And you can see them listed here at the bottom: French and Indian War, economic causes of the revolution, the ideology, the beliefs of the revolutionaries, the role of 2 important documents there from the 2 Toms, and Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, of course, and then why the Americans won the Revolutionary War. So quick question, if you can tweet your answer to this question: what is ironic about studying the causes of the American Revolution on April 15th? And I'll give you a hint. It really doesn't, it's not quite as ironic this year as it is almost every other year. So what's the connection that you might be able to see here? So without further ado, it is, of course, Hump Day. So off we go into period 3. So French and Indian War is the first subtopic. So there's a lot of background story here that we're not going to really talk about in detail. There are wars that kind of go like this. A long time ago, in a place far, far away, England and France went to war with each other. England defeated France. France was not driven off the North American continent, however. The monarch of England at the time was named King William. Therefore, we call this King William's War. Likewise, in a place long ago and far away, England and France went to war with each other. England defeats France. France is not driven out of the North American continent. The monarch of Europe at the time monarch of England, is Queen Anne. So we call this Queen Anne's War. And a little while later, in a place far, far away and a long time ago, England and France went to war with one another. England defeated France. France is not driven out of North America. The monarch of England at the time was King George II, so we call this King George's War. So hopefully you're noticing that there is a pattern here. England and France have a long history of going to war with one another, dating all the way back into things like the 100 Years' War. So a long, long history of that. And of course, the colonists are going to get caught up in all of this. The colonists at this point, it's important to remember we don't read history backwards. The colonists still view themselves as loyal British subjects. They are going to defend the monarch, as the story goes in King George's War. Louisburg, which is an important fort, was actually captured by the colonists as part of their contribution to the war effort. In this war. So long story short, England and France going to war with each other quite a bit. At the conclusion of that war, King George's War, this is kind of what the situation looks like in North America. And you can see Louisburg up here on the map, which I just referenced a couple of seconds ago. And the empires that you see are sort of broken out, very similar to what I talked about yesterday when we went through some of the colonial empires. The Spanish down here in the sort of green color, the British, of course, in the yellow color here, and the French, who have this empire in North America, which is sort of this reddish color. You'll notice this disputed region here. The British colonies, of course, are expanding westward, as they will throughout much of the rest of the course here that we're going to talk about. And the French, of course, are trying to maintain control over this region, primarily because there's a nice water connection. You can come down the St. Lawrence River, of course, and connect a little portage here over to the Ohio River all the way down to New Orleans. Um, so you can see that there's a region here that the two empires, of course, are going to come into conflict with one another. So quick shout out, David Schubert needs a shout out. So his teacher will buy him a sandwich, just like yesterday. Apparently, a lot of people are getting food out of this. So good for you. So the next war, the French and Indian War, sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War, actually begins in America, unlike the other three wars. And this war starts with a guy named George Washington. You might have heard of him before. He appears on dollar bills everywhere. And it's the very same guy, a very young George Washington at this point. So Fort Duquesne is a fort that's built in that disputed region. There is a clash of arms that takes place there between George Washington, who was sent there by the governor of Virginia, and French troops that are in the area. And this ultimately is what kicks off the French and Indian War. And really, the name of the war should be the French and the Indians on one side versus the British and their Indian allies and the colonists on the other, if you really wanted to make it an accurate title for that war. Things don't go so well for the British early on. Braddock, who was a general that was sent over to avenge Washington's defeat, is defeated. He's out in Western Pennsylvania there trying to find the French troops. And the image here really tells the story that the Native Americans were not willing to fight the way that the British wanted them to. The British, of course, had this old European style of fighting where they would line up on a field of battle and march at one another. Natives weren't going to fight that kind of battle, and you can kind of see that in the image here. So things don't go too well here for that. The Prime Minister of England changes in the middle of the war here, and he changes the strategy and eventually begins focusing on the strong points of the French Empire. Battle of Quebec is really the turning point of that war, where things begin to go in the favor of the British for the first time. And eventually the war ends, as you can see here, with the Treaty of Paris, as there are going to be many treaties of Paris. So this is the Treaty of Paris of 1763. France gives Louisiana to Spain. Spain gives Florida to the British because the Spanish actually jump in on the war late, trying to make sure that the British don't win too much here. And the West Indies were returned to whoever owned them at the beginning of the war. And so a long time ago, in a place far, far away, England and France went to war with each other. England defeats France, but in this case, the French are driven out of North America. And that's an important difference of this war, as we'll see in just a moment here. So, and one of the things that I think it's important to note about the French and Indian War is there are lots of unintended consequences like this one. There's a Native American rebellion called Pontiac's Rebellion, named, of course, for the Native American leader who organized many of these troops. And if you look at the map, you can see all the different British forts in the upper Northwest there that were attacked and or captured by Native Americans. So part of the story here is that Native Americans believed that the French would help them. The French and the English always were at war with one another, and the natives, of course, used the divide and conquer strategy against the Europeans, just as the Europeans used that same strategy against Native Americans. So there's this massive native uprising here. You can see there's a siege of Fort Detroit, which is a major fort. And all these other forts that are attacked by Native Americans here. A couple of them actually abandoned if you look carefully at the map. So totally unintended consequence. Of course, the British weren't going to war to hope for a native rebellion in the region. So one of the things the British did in order to address that is they created this thing called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And that Proclamation Line is the big red line that you see here along the map. Congratulations to all of you students out there who identified that April 15th normally is tax day, which is why it's a little bit ironic. We're talking about some of the causes of the war. We'll get to that in just a second here. So the proclamation line you can see is sort of a dividing line that's drawn here, and it mirrors or it parallels an important geographic feature in North America, and maybe we can make that our next Twitter question. So can you identify what geographic feature the proclamation line seems to run along? So the idea here is that the British are going to try to keep the Native Americans separate from the colonists. And so the colonists are no longer allowed to cross over this border, which is actually on the screen. The Native Americans, of course, are supposed to stay over on their side of the map here in order to prevent any further trouble, similar to the Pontiac's rebellion. The thing about this, though, is that the colonists were not happy about it, and they basically ignored it. And this will be an important pattern that we'll see as the story goes along here. So lots of unintended consequences. I won't spend a whole ton of time here, but interestingly, the colonials who will lead the effort against the British in the American Revolution, guess where they get their military experience? And that the answer to that question, of course, is the French and Indian War. And none other than George Washington, of course, is the most important player in that story, as we'll see. Pontiac's rebellion, of course, another unintended consequence of that war. The British remained in North America after the war. They kept a large military presence. And this was concerning to the colonists. A standing army in the 1700s was considered to be a threat to liberty. And the concern was, what exactly is going on here? The French, of course, have been defeated. Pontiac's rebellion has been the one, has been put down. So why do we need a military presence here? Is there some other more nefarious reason? And you'll see the colonists are going to identify plots everywhere by the time we're done today. The war costs a lot of money, and this is going to cause England to reconsider their old policy. You probably heard your teacher say this: salutary neglect. I always say respectful ignoring. Salutary, you salute something that you respect, and to neglect something means to leave it alone. So for a long time prior to the French and Indian War, the British government respectfully ignored the colonists. They let us kind of do our thing. They didn't enforce the navigation laws very strongly because they were benefiting well enough as it was. They're going to change that policy, as you'll see in the next segment of what we're going to talk about here. And that'll be an important part of the cause of the French and of the American Revolution. Colonies gain a sense of unity. They begin working together. The French threat is gone, as I mentioned just a second ago, and France, of course, will be waiting in the background for a chance to avenge their defeat in the French and Indian War. And that is part of the explanation for why a monarch that is arguably more of a dictator than George III ever was ultimately comes to the aid of the American colonies. We'll get to that in a second. So quick exam practice question. You might get a question like this, taking a look at a map. So briefly explain one specific historical event that contributed to the changes that you see here, one specific effect of the changes, and then another specific effect of the changes. So thinking of causation here, what caused the changes that you see here, and what were two effects of the changes that you see here. So we'll get the timer started here. All right, so hopefully you recognize that the cause of the changes here is the French and Indian War, or the Treaty of Paris of 1763 would be another potential answer for that question. That's why these chunks of land change hands here. As you can see, and the huge hint is 1763, an important turning point year in American history. One specific effect of the changes in the land claims, I think one specific effect is Pontiac's rebellion. It's a great answer for that question. Another specific effect of the changes would be the creation of the proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains, as many of you identified. So good job on that. So that's the French and Indian War, kind of get us get us through that first segment. There are different levels of causation, something to think about as we go through the question here. Relative historical significance is the bottom one, which means it's the most advanced or the most sophisticated of these. So we're going to hopefully aim towards that and ask you to think about which cause was more important than maybe the others when we get into some of the things here. Our second segment, economic causes of the American Revolution. There's lots of them, lots of examples here of economic causes. The Sugar Act, which is an act that more really than the economic cause are the enforcement provisions of that law that made the colonists angry, increasing the jurisdiction of admiralty courts, what we would call military courts today, which of course violates the right to a jury trial, enlarging the scope of writs of assistance, which were another fancy name for search warrants. Customs officials were given greater authority to search, for example, here. So the colonists are really upset as much about the tax in this case as they are about the threat to their liberty that they sense from the increased power of enforcement that you see here. But probably the best known early example of an economic cause of the American Revolution is the Stamp Act. And this was a tax on legal documents, etc., to raise revenue. So remember, the French and Indian War was expensive. The British government needs money. This is one of their ways that they're going to get this, or hope to get this, by requiring you to put a stamp on pretty much any major document is kind of the idea of that. And of course, this leads to this great, well-known phrase from the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. And you have to remember that representation meant different things in England and in America. The British believed that the colonists were represented in Parliament. They believed because the colonists were British subjects that they were represented. All British subjects were represented in Parliament. The colonists believed, of course, that you had to be a resident of the district in order to actually be a representative. In other words, the British parliamentarians really couldn't understand what life was like in America because they didn't really live in America. So, so a Twitter opinion poll here, and Ms. Farr is going to get this kicked off for us. Were the colonists more angry about the taxation part, or were they more angry about the representation part? Is it the economic consequence, or is it the representation part, the political or the civil rights consequence of this? So I kind of, when I talked about the Sugar Act, emphasized it was less the economic than the threat to their rights that they saw in the Sugar Act. So think about that question. We'll see what the Twitter poll comes up with here, which is the more important of the two. The colonists responded to the Stamp Act. They hold a meeting. 9 different colonies send representatives. They protest, and they basically make this point to the British government that the only people that can tax us are our own representatives, people in, for example, the House of Burgesses or our own town meetings. Those folks have the right to tax us, not you. And they're objecting, of course, to internal taxes, which they make this distinction that the British, I don't think, really made quite as clearly as the colonists did. An external tax would be a tax that would regulate trade, which the colonists, at least they say at this point, are okay with. But they're opposed to internal taxes, which they only believe their own colonial legislature could pass on them. And so they created all kinds of things. They drew up petitions and sent those to the king, but they also began non-importation. They stopped purchasing British goods. So they used essentially a version of a boycott, which always seems to be the most effective of the ways of protesting. It gets the government's attention there. So this ignites, the Stamp Act creates this whole firestorm of trouble for the British. And eventually, we meet this very famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, group of Americans called the Sons of Liberty, who come down to us as some of the heroes of the American Revolution. And you'll see I put a little note here on the slide. While violent resistance garnered more headlines, this is the stuff that gets people's attention. In the lower right-hand corner, you see a tax collector, Peter Oliver. His home was attacked, and they threw his belongings into the street and lit them on fire. Over here, of course, tarring and feathering was one of the famous tactics. This gets people's attention. It certainly draws headlines. And you can see the Stamp Act pasted up here upside down on the Liberty tree in the background of this cartoon over here. But boycotting was more effective in getting the British government to do anything. So we're going to watch a short little clip here. It sort of reviews quickly some of the members of the Sons of Liberty from a recent it's not really a documentary. It tells the story of the Sons of Liberty a little bit overly dramatized, I think. But this is a nice introduction to some of the main characters there.
I think the Sons of Liberty are definitely soldiers of opportunity. They wanted freedom. They wanted an existence of their own.
I think we were a match that lit a fire and exposed the rest of the colonies to the tyranny of the Crown and Parliament at the time.
This will not happen to anyone in Boston ever again. We need more guns.
If you're going on a revolution, you want Sam Adams on your right shoulder. He approaches things from a very straightforward physical point of view, which is different from John Adams and how Hancock and maybe Franklin also would like to approach getting to the end post.
Sam is our leader. He gives the speeches that get to your marrow and get you excited about what we're doing. But he's also a leader from the front as opposed to a leader from the back.
It is my pleasure to welcome you all.
I think John Hancock has the biggest character arc in terms of him being in a different place at the end than what it was at the beginning.
He took my house.
Of course he did.
He becomes more than a man simply trying to get his possessions and his power back. We see him waking up to this extraordinary moment in history that he's absolutely involved in.
Gage has the British Empire, an endless supply of weapons, trained soldiers, a navy.
We need a better plan.
I think John Adams is always sympathetic to the cause. It's just he's a man who's ruled by law. He was a leading man in his community, and people respected his opinions.
John, this is hopeless. These men are cowards. They are... We need these men. We have to find another way of convincing them.
John Adams was sort of the voice of reason. There was a visceral emotional attachment to the cause where he was able to step back and see the entire chessboard. So he was a good guide in terms of using the passion we're able to generate and directing it into something purposeful.
Mr. Revere, I am John Hancock, and I would like to thank you for letting us use your workshop.
Hell, for what you're paying for, you could have had the place.
Revere saw himself both as an artisan as well as a gentleman, which was a new idea on class. He very much was an intelligence operator, and he could maneuver and operate amongst these different groups of people.
This was a group of ordinary guys in all respects. We think of them as these mythological beings, but they were these guys that got together and ended up moving mountains, really.
Okay, so that's a little History Channel thing that they did on the Sons of Liberty, and
I think the Sons.
So a little introduction to some of those the characters there. Certainly, they play an important part, and it's a lot of other characters that, of course, are unknown to history that are supportive of that. So what do the British do with the Stamp Act, kind of picking up the story here? They repeal the Stamp Act, and the colonists, I think, take an important lesson away from that, that if they cause enough trouble, the British government seems to give in. And the British government also at the same time passed a law called the Declaratory Act, which said, hey, just in case you forgot, we do have the right to tax you whenever we feel like it. We're just kind of taking a time out from this. And most of the colonists kind of ignore the Declaratory Act and celebrate the death of the Stamp Act, which is what you see in the cartoon here. They're taking the Stamp Act to its grave on the little casket here that you see. Quartering Act is passed at the same time. The Twitter poll says about 80% of you think that it is the civil rights or lack of representation that's more important. And this is a good example of that as well. The colonists were expected to house and supply British regular soldiers, which colonists viewed, of course, as a violation of their right to privacy. It's forcing us to support soldiers that might not be really here for our own best interest, might be one way of putting that. There's another series of round of taxation in 1767 called the Townshend duties. These were taxes on lead, paint, paper, glass, and tea. And Shout out to my college history professor. That's always the way I've said it because that's the way he taught it many, many years ago. So Dr. Carson, a little shout out to you. So the Townsend duties, same thing happens here. The British government tries to make some money off the colonies. There's a whole new round of non-importation, and a whole new round of tarring and feathering, and protests being sent to the British government. So one of the British responses, of course, is to send more troops to the colonies, keep an eye on these troublemakers, especially these folks in Boston. And this very famous event happens on March the 5th, 1770. It's called, in this case, the Boston Massacre. And you can see in this wonderful piece of propaganda by Paul Revere that the colonists are, at least in this version of the story, clearly the innocents. They're being shot. This guy is actually being shot in the back. If you follow the story here, it does not seem all that chaotic for the British soldiers. They're being ordered, it looks like, by their officer to fire into the crowd. And if you read through some of the depositions of people that actually witnessed this, this isn't really 100% accurate to the story. The soldiers were surrounded and were actually being threatened by the colonists, and snowballs were being thrown at them. And it was much more chaotic, certainly, than the scene here suggests. But when we're trying to make a revolution, of course, we want to turn this into an important event. And that's exactly what Paul Revere does. And if we don't get the point from all of that, from all the imagery here, he labels the building right over the top of the British soldiers as Butcher's Hall. And so now we have, for the first time, British soldiers have actually killed 5 Americans in this growing confrontation between the colonies and the mother country. So the Townsend duties are mostly reduced, except for the tax on tea. And this, again, another famous tax on the colonists. In this case, though, interestingly, the Tea Act actually would have lowered the cost of legal tea. So the folks that were really upset about this were the smugglers that were making money by cheating or getting, sneaking around the British laws here. And by this point, the colonists believe that the mother country is trying to get them to pay this tax just to prove a point that they can actually tax the colonists. And there's a famous reaction to this. Hopefully you're anticipating where I'm going here. It's called the Boston Tea Party. And this is where the colonists actually take action. And they went on board these British ships that had not yet been unloaded. They dumped 342 chests of tea in Boston Harbor. And they're, as the classic story goes, they're dressed as Mohawk Indians, but everybody knew who it was. Native Americans certainly were not going to come and destroy British tea. They're trying to, of course, mask their identity, is the whole idea of that. So now you have the colonists actually reacting in a much more physical way against the mother country, in a sense. So the British government responds, and hopefully you see here, we're kind of getting into this snowball that happens. The British government passes a series of laws they call the coercive acts. The colonists refer to them as the intolerable acts. And there are several examples here of things that happened, but the harbor of Boston was closed down until the tea was paid for. Local self-government was not allowed. The British military commander was made the governor of Massachusetts, so we no longer have civilian authority there. It's basically a military government that's going to be in place. And the colonists referred to these as intolerable, which are threats to their liberty, as we mentioned a little bit before. So these are things that are both economic and civil liberties, or violations of their rights that they're upset about here. And you can see the Boston Port Bill in the guy's back pocket here in this little very famous image of that story. So the colonists have a meeting, as they did with the Stamp Act. They come up with a thing called the Association, which carries out non-importation, again, economic response here. But they're not ready to declare independence, and that's an important part of the story here. Again, we don't want to read history backwards because we know where this is going at this point. But in 1774, most colonists were not supportive of declaring independence or creating their own government. They simply wanted their rights within the British Empire. Of course, we had the famous showdown between the Minutemen and British troops in Lexington and Concord, which is often considered the first battle of the American Revolution. And off we go. So this is a modern Google Maps image of Lexington itself. You can figure out where most of the Minutemen were probably hanging out before the British troops showed up. There's a tavern there, which were very important in early American history. And so the following year, there's another Continental Congress, another meeting here. And again, just to reiterate the point, the goal here is still reconciliation, still kissing and making up with the British. They're only resisting what they saw as unfair acts being taken against them. So we're still not ready to declare independence yet. So keep that in mind as we move forward here. So kind of a lot of me talking. So let's do a quick little exam practice question. So this is what is Adams's argument? Can you pull the argument out of this quick little quote here? Start the timer. All right. Quick little shout out. Christian Lee asked for a shout out. I promised me his firstborn child. I'll pass on that, but a little shout out to you. And the first person killed in Boston Massacre, the first student that answered that, Grace Earn. So congratulations to the two of you. So what is Adams really saying here in a letter much after the American Revolution is over? In 1815, and what he's suggesting here is that the change in ideas is really the revolution. It's not the Revolutionary War. That the change in mindset of the colonists, that they needed to resist the unfair actions of the British, is much more important than the war. At least according to John Adams here. All right, moving along, ideology of the revolutionaries. What are the things that they believed? And I'll go through this very quickly. There's lots of roots of the ideas in the revolution. They come from all kinds of different places. So the ancient world, I mean, the American system, the democratic system, traces its history all the way back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and they give you a couple examples there. The Commonwealth experience from English history. So if you know, if you remember your English history from world history or global studies, whatever it was that you studied, wherever you've studied this before, the English have always had the sensitivity to protecting their rights against the king, especially dating all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And the colonists were part of that tradition. They believed that government should be limited and that democracy and representative democracy was important. John Locke, who is an English writer from the Enlightenment, is a huge influence on the colonists, who argues some of the things that I mentioned here on this slide. That government should be run by the consent of the government, that all people have natural rights. Government is created to protect those rights. And if government does not protect those rights, then people have the right to rebel against that government. Keep that in mind when we get to Jefferson in just a little bit here. And then the colonial experience, they had for a long time controlled their own lives. They had experienced democracy, for example, in town meetings in the House of Burgesses. And then you add into that whole mix the Enlightenment of the 1700s, which is John Locke, of course, is an Enlightenment philosopher, but the idea of limited government, the idea of individual liberties, that law should be the ruler, not a king. These are all part and parcel of what the colonists are thinking as the American Revolution comes along. And these would be things that John Adams would cite as the changes in mindset that happen in the colonies that lead to the American Revolution, or in his view, are the American Revolution. So we're going to look very quickly at two excerpts from important documents from that period. So the first one is from the original Thomas Paine. Common Sense is his document. We kind of already covered that. So thinking about common sense, it's written early in 1776. So who is he writing this for? He's writing it for colonial citizens. He might be writing it for politicians in British North America. He's also writing, and if you look at the purpose, it sort of blends together with this. He wants to convince Americans that the only option now is to declare independence, and he will be very influential in convincing people of that. He's an important part of the story here. It's a really important document. Paine is born in England These are some of the background pieces of this, the historical situation that we would call it. And his point of view is that America has no choice but to declare independence from Britain. And he wants to convince all of us of that. In fact, he believes it's just common sense that we all should understand exactly what it is. So he uses a metaphor here that, if you read through the quote here with me quickly, he says, I've heard it asserted by some that because America has done so well under its connection with Britain, that we should continue that, that our future happiness is important to do the same thing. And he says, nothing is more fallacious. That's false. Fancy word for false. We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. So he's arguing that if the colonies are the child in the mother country's view, that the child is growing up here and that things are changing. And he goes on, and there's all kinds of great examples in here about he talks about even brutes do not devour their young, and he always uses these great, really nasty words to refer to the King of England, and brute is one of them, certainly. Savages do not make war upon their own families, so he's playing along on that metaphor about the family. I challenge the person that wants to reconcile with England to show an advantage that we have. He's, again, going after the counter argument here. As a good APS they would, right? He's addressing the other side of the story here. We're not, there's no benefit to sticking around with England is essentially what he's saying here. Great Britain gets us involved in wars that aren't really our problem. And here he capitalizes, just like you would in a text message, to emphasize the blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. It's time for us to be out of the British Empire. There's no doubt about that anymore. And then down here, he says, where, say some, is the King of America? He reigns above and does not make havoc of mankind. And what he says here essentially is the law is the king in America. And that's a revolutionary statement for the 1700s, that the law is our ruler, not the king. Really very much challenging this whole old idea of the divine right of kings. So Thomas Paine writes this very lengthy, I just gave you a few quick, short pieces out of that very lengthy pamphlet that he printed. And it very much has the effect of encouraging Americans to support the idea of independence. Quick multiple choice question there for you. So which historical process could we connect this with? And hopefully we won't even wait for the whole time to end here. So is it desire to fund transportation improvements? Definitely not. It's not what he's up to here. Persistence of aspects of African culture. That's not what he's talking about here, certainly. Alliances between Europeans and Native Americans is not the topic of common sense. That's not what he's talking about. Of course, it's D. Enlightenment ideas that we see in here, that people have rights, that law is the king, not the divine right of kings. Now, the other Tom, of course, is Thomas Jefferson, and not sure where this quote comes from, but it's the night before the Declaration of Independence was signed, so it might be true, but probably not. So Jefferson, in the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, sets out the beliefs of America. In many ways, this is our creed. And you'll see the Enlightenment ideas here, right? All men are created equal, that they have inalienable rights, as he calls them, that among these are, and he lists the rights for us, governments are created, getting their power from the governed. I mean, this is classic Enlightenment stuff here. Then he goes on to say, when government becomes destructive of those ends, it's our right to change or to get rid of it and to create a new government. And of course, you know now where Jefferson is heading with this, that this is the philosophical background of the revolution, that we have the right, we have rights that can't be taken away from this. And then he goes on, this is a great line here. The history of the present king of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. The king constantly is attacking our rights, and he's trying to create a tyrannical system. And then he goes on to say, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So you have to remember, Jefferson's a lawyer, and he gives us his opening statement in the Declaration, his sort of the philosophical background of this, and then he gives us his proof. And these are just some of the examples of things. So can you think of some of the specific acts Jefferson might be referring to here in this? He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He might be talking about the situation in Boston where Thomas Gage becomes the leader of Boston, where the military is running the show. For quartering large bodies of armed troops. Hopefully you read that as quartering act. Cutting off our trade. Hopefully you see that as mercantilism. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. Stamp Act is a good example of that, right? Depriving us of the benefits of trial by jury. That's the Sugar Act. So long, on and on and on. And this is just a very short segment out of that list that Jefferson gives us. That are very specific examples of things that were going on that he saw as threats to American liberty. So let's give you a second just to kind of think about this. What's this historical situation? What's a purpose? And what's a piece of evidence that Jefferson uses? So the simple answer to that first one is the situation, of course, is what's going on in 1775 and 1776, things like Lexington and Concord, things like the Battle of Bunker Hill, things like the Second Continental Congress beginning to meet and to resist. A purpose, hopefully you don't fall into the trap of keeping this simple and saying, well, of course, we're declaring independence. There's another purpose here, right? Jefferson is trying to justify to the rest of the world why the Americans are declaring independence and stating this in terms of Enlightenment thinking, which is becoming more and more acceptable in the world. And then one piece of evidence, I just went through that in the last slide just before we got to this question here. There's lots of pieces of evidence that Jefferson uses to support his argument. So in many ways, Jefferson does a really nice job, as well as Thomas Paine, in writing an AP essay, right? He gives us the background of it and then gives us all kinds of evidence to support his argument, as you can see here. How the Americans won the war. The British have all the advantages, as you can see here: population, wealth. They have a powerful Navy, but the Americans win for a lot of different reasons. One is a belief in their cause. One is that the British supply lines are really long. They have to send supplies all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. There is a question in England about whether or not they should actually even continue fighting the war. And as the longer the war wears on, the more you find people in England that are not quite as supportive of it. And there's also, of course, important leaders in the story here, American leaders, that the two most prominent I'll mention quickly here: Ben Franklin, who is involved in pretty much everything. Every major document of the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin has his name on it. He is the most famous American in Europe. When he goes there, he's recognized as a scientist. Of course, you know the famous story of the kite, flying the kite in the middle of the lightning storm. Wouldn't recommend that, but and then, of course, all these other documents that I mentioned here. He's on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence. He negotiates a treaty to get France to help the colonists during the Revolution. He negotiates the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ends the American Revolution. And he actually goes to the Constitutional Convention as well, and serves there in a role really of trying to help people find the middle ground between extreme positions. And one could argue that we need a Ben Franklin these days in our politics. The other person, of course, is George Washington, who we started the story with today, actually. He was a soldier in the French and Indian War. He becomes the leader of the Continental Army. All these famous stories about Washington, famously crossing the Delaware and winning this very important victory late in 1776, when things just didn't seem to be going very well for the colonists or the colonial cause. He manages the military effort despite a weak national government that is not really able to give him very much assistance. They're short of food, they're short of supplies, they're short of money, etc. And then he refuses to take dictatorial power, and I'll talk about that on Friday when we come back to him becoming president. Other groups also aided. It's all different Americans that helped out here. So it's not just Washington and Franklin, but women play a really important role in the victory in the war. So women served as spies and nurses. They raised money. They knitted socks for soldiers. They served as camp followers, where they would do all kinds of jobs to help soldiers. So on rare occasions, the famous myth of Molly Pitcher, the woman that supposedly takes her husband's place at a cannon, and Deborah Sampson, who successfully convinces the military that she's a man and gets herself actually admitted into the military. Artisans, people like Paul Revere, who is really more of a middle-class person that joins on here. And of course, the French are an important part of that as well. So let's get to the DBQ. So DBQ practice. So the question here is, evaluate the extent of change of ideas about American independence from 1763 to 1783. So what is this asking? That's the first thing to ask yourself when you look at a prompt. What is how much, the extent to which, how much did ideas about American independence change from 1763 to 1783. Jake Dew, good job figuring out what John Locke originally said that Thomas Jefferson changed. Locke, of course, talked about life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changes that property to pursuit of happiness. So our question here is, how much changes in the ideas from the period that we're really talking about here? So if you were my student, I would ask you to brainstorm this before you ever look at documents. What's different from 1763 to 1783? What didn't change? Were there groups of people in America that did not change their attitude about independence in that 20-year time period? What could we use for contextualization? What's the background of our story? So let's think about what the date is here. One easy way to think about contextualization is, what's the background story? 1763 is an important year in the question. 1763 is the end of the French and Indian War. So that would be a good piece of contextualization for this, right? The Enlightenment is another example that's on the screen you can see here. There's lots of other examples here, and I know we're running a little short on time. So here's an example. The French and Indian War caused Britain to increase involvement in the affairs of the colonies. British leaders believed that the colonists who had been beneficiaries of the war should be required to assist in paying for it. This was achieved through a series of taxes. Now, of course, you would hope the student would go on to talk about some of those taxes. So how much changes? So we're going to come up with a working thesis here. The ideas about American independence changed greatly from 1763 to 1783. They changed a lot. Remember what the question is. What's the extent of change? So I'm answering that here. In the beginning, colonists only wanted representation and a say in the legislation of new laws, but by 1783, Americans wanted true independence from British rule. So notice how the second line of that goes into a little more detail, right? It gives us some more specifics of that. So when we look at the documents here, I want you to think about how does the document work with our thesis, or does it not work with our thesis? Because maybe it doesn't. So here's the first document. I remember a lot of students struggle with this. It seems simple at first, but there's actually a little bit more going on here. So obviously the references to the Stamp Act, it's early on here. The teapot is made, it says between 1766 and 1770. But notice it's made in England. It's not made in the colonists. So this might be a document that leads us to talk a little bit about people in England might have been more sympathetic to the colonists than maybe we initially thought about. So some possible answers here, some things to think about. And again, if we source the documents, what's the background here? The growing trade between Britain and the colonies. British manufacturers capitalized or profited from the Stamp Act crisis might be the reason why this teapot was created. Who's the audience of this? It's people that are going to buy a teapot in England and maybe the colonies as well. So how does it tie into our question, our thesis? Our thesis is ideas change. Well, in 1765, hopefully you would mention that the colonists are not seeking independence in the Stamp Act crisis. What did they want? They said no taxation without representation. They want a representation. They're not seeking independence. So this is a good document to get us started on looking at our argument overall. It's the beginning of the time period. So take 40 seconds or so to read through this and think about same thing. How does this help support our argument? All right, I know it's a lot to digest in 40 seconds here, but so if you read through carefully, what they're basically doing here in this document is they're asking the king to fix the problems of unfair taxation. So 1769, so what's happened in the meantime? The Townsend duties, of course, are happening. If you look at the middle paragraph here, it says it's the opinion of this committee that it is the undoubted privilege of the inhabitants of this colony to petition their sovereign, the King of England, for redress of grievance. So they're asking the king to fix the taxing problem here. No mention of independence at all in this document. So they're respectfully asking the king to reconsider his position on taxes. In the first line, of course, the first paragraph, they talk about it is the right to tax is legally and constitutionally vested in the House of Burgesses, the local legislature, as opposed to the king. But they're not being disrespectful, and they're certainly not declaring independence at this point. Okay, so again, the context of this, the concepts and the resolves are going to spread to other colonies. This idea is not going to be unique to Virginia, certainly, and other British North American colonial assemblies might be the audience of this. To think about other people reading this to come up with their same argument about taxation, this overall idea about taxation, really the right to tax being in the hands of the local colonials rather than the British government. All right, this one hopefully shouldn't be too bad. Take a second to read through this one. All right, so hopefully you know who Sam Adams is after that little video introduction that we saw a little bit before. And hopefully if you read through this, you are noticing that he talks about something a couple of times here. So all men have the right to remain in a state of nature. He talks about when men enter into society, it is by voluntary consent. He talks about the natural liberty of man, not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but having the law of nature for his rule. So hopefully you're recognizing that he is basically talking about Enlightenment ideas here. And so you could insert into our argument this connection to the growing influence of Enlightenment ideas. For example, the right of the consent of the governed, for example, some of the things that Jefferson will cite 4 years later. Of course, the point of view is from a patriot. This is not a British subject suggesting this. He's kind of pointing out that people have the right to create their own government, and he is indicating perhaps that he's not real happy with the way things are going here. Again, the Enlightenment idea here kind of is part of the purpose here, and he's very much including that in this. So how does it connect to our thesis? Well, we don't have Sam Adams declaring independence here, certainly, but he's criticizing the government for not following the ideals of the Enlightenment. So we might tie that into our argument that Americans are beginning to sense or beginning to wonder whether or not the form of government that they're living under really fits with Enlightenment ideas of consent of the governed, for example, or the social compact, as John Locke would call it. All right, this one's a little tougher. So take a second to read through this, and let's figure out what we can do with this one. All right, so hopefully you had a chance to read through that one. This one's a little tougher. If you look at the second paragraph here, he said they say, we are therefore incited by a concern for the peace and welfare to declare against every usurpation of power and authority in opposition to the laws of the government. And they talk at the end here about earnestly desiring the restoration of harmony and concord, which have united the people of these provinces. So this is actually a document that does not support our argument. This is a person, Quakers, of course, typically are pacifists and are opposed to war, and that's exactly what they're talking about here. So this is a group of people that might give us a little angle on the complexity piece here, the complexity point. They don't support this. Their ideas about American independence aren't really changing. In fact, they're staying the same here. They're saying that they don't like what's happening here, and they don't certainly support it. Document 5, let's give this one a quick look. So let's think about what she's saying here. It's a journal of a lady of quality, which means she's upper class. And she talks at the end that the method that she describes there has seldom failed with the lower sort. And what she means by that is the lower class. So this is a person that is not real thrilled with the way the Patriots are operating here. As she says, they show up at your plantation and they give you an option of either you join the cause and we won't do anything to your house and to your possessions. And if you don't join our cause, we're taking all the stuff anyway. So, and she's being very critical of that. So she, like the document before, is not supportive of the revolution, and she certainly is not supportive of independence. So her ideas aren't changing either. Let's try document 6. All right, so hopefully you didn't fall into the mistake that many students that wrote this question typically run into. They see the taxation piece in the document and they assume that this is a person that's very supportive of the revolution, and of course he hates taxation, etc. But that's not what he's saying. He is an Anglican church minister, so he's an official of the state church. So we would think typically that he would not be supportive of the revolution. And actually what he argues is that we can't afford to pay our bills now. How could, under the taxes that we're currently living under, how could we possibly ever afford a revolution? So he, like the other two documents just before this, 4 and 5, are the other side of the story. These are people that do not support, or their ideas don't really change about revolution. So this invites us to talk about loyalists, people in the colonies that their ideas didn't change either about the revolution. So and the last document, this nice little short one for us to kind of wrap things up today. All right, so Thomas Paine, we had a quick look through Common Sense, who this is the same author, of course, and what's he saying here? That we need to stick with it. You know, tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, as he says here, right? And good words for dealing with the COVID situation. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. That is, the tougher it is for us to win, the better it's going to feel when we actually do win. And here he's writing this document at the end of the year of 1776. It's almost 12 months after the publication of Common Sense. And the situation of what's going on, things have not gone well for the colonial cause, and he's trying to sort of revive people's spirits here. So in supporting independence. And notice the date, it's December the 23rd. The next day will be Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware, where he wins this important victory that sort of revives the colonial hopes here. So Thomas Paine, of course, is the end of the time period here, and he is very much a supporter of independence. So we could use him to support our argument about how much ideas had changed, certainly from 1763. So we had three documents that don't really support our thesis. So might be a good time for us to think about going back and changing that thesis and making it a little bit more, making it fit the documents a little bit more. So let the documents drive your essay, is the point I'm trying to make here. So because three of the documents, as you saw, don't really fit what we started out with. So debriefing five quick big ideas here. French and Indian War is a long-range cause of the American Revolution. Economic issues increase the divide between mother country and the colonies. The Stamp Act, the Tea Act are a couple examples. Lots of ideas in the background here for the colonials. Two important documents I talked about, Common Sense and the Declaration. And then there are many reasons for the victory of the colonies, which we saw here at the end, and spent a little bit of time thinking about how all this stuff sort of fits together with what we have. So that's all the time we have. I'm sorry that we went a little bit past noon here, but hopefully you found this to be useful. Thanks again for tuning in. Tomorrow, Ms. Farr will be taking us from this point, the revolution is won, to what happens next. So hopefully you tune in. We'll see you then. Thanks. Have a great day.